Great, welcome everybody to the third day of our online development camp. With this video, I want to open the session today, and because we have an exciting season ahead of us, that was a was a video from past season where we were in Planica the first time for the Nordic cross country and biathlon events, and we hope we can get similar videos this year and pictures from the upcoming World Cups and championships and games. So we have an exciting season ahead of us. Today we have the session around classification and anti-doping. So I'm happy to welcome Dia Pernod, the head of classification of World Para Nordic skiing, and Jude Ellis, I hope I pronounced it correct, the IPC anti-doping education manager. Who are the experts on those two topics. So I'm very happy to have both of them here with us today. And please feel free to ask questions in the chat along the way. And then after each presentation, you have some time to also directly ask the questions. So please feel free to ask anything that comes onto your mind. You have the experts in front of you. And with that, I want to get right started with the classification piece. With Dia.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you. You hear me? Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Good evening. Thank you, Elke. My name is Dia Pernod. I'm head of classification in Nordic skiing, and right now, Elke, you are sharing the screen with the presentation, huh?
I think you can see the screen.
Yeah, I see it. I would like to talk about Paralympic classification. Can you give me the next slide? So this is an overview. I would just a few minutes about the history of classification, and then I would like to talk about what is classification and the steps of athlete evaluation. Of course, about eligible impairments, something about the minimal impairment criteria, the sport class allocation, and the sport class status. So when we go back to the history of classification, I think first classification. Yeah, what is classification? The definition of classification is that the classification in Paralympic sport determines who is eligible to compete in parasport, and it groups the eligible athletes in several sport classes according to their activity limitation. And to understand classification, I would like to go back to its roots. And then I think the next slide, Elke. Classification started in 1948. That was with the first Stoke-Mandeville Games by Sir Dr. Ludwig. And he invented, he had a medical classification system. And that time, all the people, for example, with a spinal cord injury were together in one class. Later on, the classification system developed, and when we go back to the Barcelona Paralympic Games, then they started to be more functional classification. And then since 2005, it was by the athlete code. But then now it's more sport specific and evidence based. So this is a little bit about the history of Paralympic classification. What we do in classification is we are grouping athletes into the sport according to how much their impairment affects their activity. So we want to have the least impact by the impairment on the activity level. And then the classification is evidence-based and sport-specific. Can I have the next one? So what are the eligible impairments? To be eligible for the Paralympic sport, IPC had 10 eligible impairments. For Nordic skiing, we have 8. We have the impaired muscle power, the impaired passive range of movement, limb deficiency, leg length difference, visual impairment, hypertonia, ataxia, and atytosis. And like the intellectual impairment, that's an eligible impairment too, but not for Nordic skiing. And to be eligible for the sport, there must be an underlying health condition. For example, you can have an impaired muscle power based on a spinal cord injury, or you can have a limb deficiency based on an amputation you had, or dysmelia. So there must be an underlying health condition. You are eligible for the sport. For example, if you have impaired muscle power because of a chronic pain syndrome, that's not a health condition, and then you're because that's not an underlying health condition, and so then the impaired muscle power is not an eligible impairment. Can I go the next slide? To find out if an athlete has an eligible impairment. So the first question is, does the athlete has an eligible impairment? So one of the impairments I just told, muscle power, limb deficiency, a leg length difference, or a visual impairment, and there must be an underlying health condition. And then the next question is the impairment severe enough to meet the minimal impairment criteria? For example, in Nordic skiing, when you have an amputation of your big toe, then it is it's a part of a limb deficiency, but it doesn't meet the minimal impairment criteria. You need to have an amputation through the ankle or your lower limb, so to meet the impairment criteria. And then after you set the criteria for these minimal impairment criteria, then we look in which sport class does the athlete fit into. And to go through this whole process, can I have the next slide? Yeah, we do the medical functional evaluation. We do extensive evaluation of muscle power, of range of movement, of leg length measurements, or we look at trunk stability. And then we also do a sport technical observation on the snow. So that's the sport specific part. And then, of course, we do observation during the first competition. So it's the observation during first appearance. So this whole process brings you to the sport class. Can I have the next slide? So in Nordic skiing, we have 5 sitting classes. It's the LW12. This class has a good trunk stability till 11.5, LW11, LW10.5, and LW10. That's the sport class with the most impaired trunk stability. Then we have the 7 standing classes from LW2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, and 9. And then we also have the 3 classes of the visual impaired athletes. Can I have the next one? And then the sport class status. So you get, if you are going to be classified for the first time, you get the sport class status new, and you get a review for example, with a fixed date. Then it means that you get a new classification in 1 or 2 years, and the confirmed status, then that's the status you're going to have, and it's not going to change anymore. So these are the sport class statuses. Can I have the next one? So here are, we have, of course, an extensive rule book with classification rules and regulations. And then here on the left side, you see the 10 steps for classification is how to come to, I think this is on the website, Elke, these 10 steps for classification.
Mm-hmm. It's available on the website.
Yeah. So you can go through it to find out what steps to be needed to get classified. I think that was the last one. Is there? Yeah. Are there any questions? Or are there any questions in the chat? Let's. Can you see that, Elke? If there are any
no questions so far. It was probably a lot to digest in a very short time frame because classification is it's a big topic. But feel free to ask anything about the process, about how the assessment works, when are the athletes classified, and so on. So if you have any questions around that, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand.
Yeah, or feel free to put them in the chat so we can go through them.
Maybe I can add here that, for example, now in the beginning, so classification happens usually in the beginning of the season. So we have two events planned for next week at the World Cup in Canmore in Canada, and another event in Vocati in mid of December on classification. So to have this cleaned out kind of early in the season, so that it's not that the athletes can compete along the season without being classified later on. And in general, it's good to add also the assessment takes around 30 to 45 minutes. It depends on the athlete, plus the technical assessment on the snow, plus observation during the race. But that's this document is very helpful to, if you have not been in touch or in contact with classification before, to see the steps that are needed to sign up for it, what documents need to be provided, and how to present at the event. Okay, I don't see questions coming in. If there's no further, then can move on to the second part, which is about the anti-doping, and I think Trude has prepared a presentation for that. So please feel free
so I'll just share it with you. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, can you see that?
Not yet. Okay, now looking good.
Looks good. Can't see my notes, yes. Just the slides. Okay, thanks everybody for joining today's webinar. Hopefully you will find it helpful and interesting. So before I start, I'll just thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself. I'm speaking with a New Zealand accent, so I know that some people find me hard to understand, especially when I talk fast. So if I start talking gibberish, please just put your hand up or tell Elke to tell me to slow down, and she'll kick me under the table. I've worked in anti-doping for a long time, but before I worked in anti-doping many years ago, when I was young, I was also an athlete. So I have had to provide samples in many little beakers myself. So I've had a wide range of experience, and I really want to sort of bring that experience to you today to give you some good tips. So these are the main topics for discussion today. I could actually talk to you probably all day about anti-doping, but I've only got about 40 minutes. Some of you listening to this webinar may already have a lot of experience with anti-doping, and maybe others don't have much at all. For those of you with experience, my presentation should reinforce what you already know. And if you're not so familiar with anti-doping, hopefully it's not too much information, and at the end you'll at least be a lot better informed. There's a lot of information to cover, but I'm going to focus on particular things that you need to know, and I'm going to try and give you some really practical tips to make sure that you know what your anti-doping responsibilities are and to protect you from inadvertently breaking the rules. I'm probably going to talk for about 30 minutes, and please, there's no such thing as a stupid question. When I was a young athlete, I had lots of stupid questions. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and we can talk about them at the end. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what the anti-doping rules are. We'll talk about medications and supplements, which is really important to make sure you don't accidentally dope. I'll whiz you through the doping control process, or talk about what happens if you do break the rules, and last but not least, where to find out more, with a very special treat for you in terms of a course especially for Beijing. Okay, page down, go. Next slide, hang on a sec. I'm jammed. Oh, next slide. How did I make it go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Anti-doping rules. Okay, so the World Anti-Doping Code, hopefully you've all heard of that. That's like the master code for all of the other anti-doping rules. So every international sports federation and every national anti-doping organisation bases their anti-doping rules on the World Anti-Doping Code. So what that means, for example, is it doesn't matter if you're a swimmer from Uzbekistan or a cross-country skier from Italy or an ice hockey player from Canada or a tennis player from Australia. The same rules, or at least very similar rules, apply to everybody. The rules are there to protect the rights of clean athletes so that they can compete fairly in clean sport. Obviously, it's not fair that athletes dope or cheat to improve their performance and win the medals. But nor is it fair that an athlete feels like they have to dope if they want to be competitive. Everybody wants to compete on a level playing field. Now, you may not realise it, but you're actually subject to at least 2 sets of anti-doping rules. You're subject to the IPC's anti-doping code when you participate in the Paralympic Games, and if you're a member or a participant of a sport that's under the IPC's umbrella, and this includes Para Nordic scheme. You're also subject to the rules of your national anti-doping organisation. So, for example, if you're a Nordic skier from Japan, the IPC's anti-doping rules apply to you at the Games and as your international federation, and the Japanese anti-doping organisation rules also apply to you. So it's all harmonised and it all works together. Okay, the prohibited list. This is a very key part of the code. This is the list of all the substances and methods that are prohibited or banned in sport. And there are 3 categories. There's substances that are banned at all times. So, for example, anabolic steroids are banned all the time. There are some substances that are only banned in competition, such as stimulants. And some sports there are only substances that are banned only in some sports. So, for example, alcohol is banned in motorsport. And there are also some substances that are only banned if they're found to be over a certain threshold of concentration in your sample. So, for example, asthma medication, where someone abuses their asthma medication and takes too much to try and get an advantage, and then the concentration is too high in their sample. So the list is reviewed and updated by WADA every year. There's a consultation process that happens every year, and then the new list is published in October, and then it becomes into effect on the 1st of January. So there's a new list coming into force on the 1st of January 2022, just before Lillehammer. And there are some really important changes in that list that I'm going to come back to and talk to a bit later on. So the thing you need to know about the list is it is complicated. So I've worked in anti-doping for a long time, but I don't have a medical or science background, so I cannot understand the list. It's not as simple as reading the ingredients listed on your medication or supplement and comparing that with the substances that are on the list. And that is because it's just not possible to list every substance that is banned. If a substance is not on the list, but it has the same chemical structure or it has the same biological effect, then it's prohibited, even though it's not on the list. So, you know, for example, supplement manufacturers will create designer steroids with a new name that does exactly the same as a regular anabolic steroid, but it's got its own name. Quite often there are different names used for different substances. So really, only if you've got a science or a medical background can you understand the list. Don't try and interpret it yourself. Take the list physically to your doctor or to the chemist, the pharmacist or the nutritionist. Tell them, hey, I'm an athlete subject to testing. Here's the list. Can you please don't give me anything that's on the list? So the other thing that's important about the list is the principle of strict liability. So what this means is that you are responsible for any banned any banned substance that is found in your sample. So if you do test positive and you didn't mean to dope, strict liability means it's very important that you can identify and explain how that substance came to be in your body. And if you can't, then that probably means you're going to get a harsher sanction, a longer ban than you otherwise would. So accidental or inadvertent doping happens quite a lot, and it's awful. Most anti-doping organisations don't want to deal with it because we want to catch the real dopers, not the ones that make the mistakes. So what can you do to avoid it? Most, in fact, I would probably say all accidental or unintentional doping is usually caused by a medication or supplement that the athlete's taken that contains a banned substance, and subsequently the athlete tests positive. So I want to talk about medications first. Medications are regulated. So this means that you can generally trust the manufacturing process and you can trust the list of ingredients on a medication. There's two types of medication. First is the one that is prescribed to you by your doctor. So, for example, antibiotics or asthma medication. And then there's the over-the-counter medication. That's where you can just go into a chemist and buy something to treat your cold or for your headache. The number one rule, always, always, always tell your doctor or tell the pharmacist that you're an athlete and you're subject to the anti-doping rules. Give them the list. They have the expertise to understand it, and they'll be able to tell if a medication that they're going to give you contains a banned substance. Some athletes are very lucky and they can actually do their own check of medications at an online tool called globaljoe.com. So this currently includes Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Japan. So if you buy a medication in that country, you can check on Global Joe whether it contains anything that's banned. But be very careful, because if you buy the same medication in a different country, it might have different substances in it. So medications around the world have all the same name, perhaps, but they might be made quite a little bit different in each country. So what if you need to take a medication? What if you've got a condition and you really need to take it for your health? Well, if there's no other alternative medication, what you're probably going to need is a therapeutic use exemption, or a TUE. Now, you apply for a TUE. Or to apply, it needs to be completed by both you and your doctor, because obviously a lot of medical information is needed. The TUE certificate gives you permission to take the medication, and it comes with certain conditions. It will tell you the dosage you're allowed to take, the time period you're allowed to take the medication for, and whatever other conditions there are. And how do you get a TUE? So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. International level athletes apply to the IPC for a TUE. So each international federation decides which of their athletes are going to be classified as international level athletes. So here is some homework for you all to do after this webinar. I want you to go to the Para Nordic skiing anti-doping page on the website, and you'll see a link to a list of international level athletes, and there's a list of athlete names from Nordic skiing, and see if you're on that list. If you're on that list, then you're an international level athlete. If you compete at the Paralympic Games, you're an international level athlete. These lists sometimes include other events like World Championships. I'm not sure if Lillehammer's on the list, but do your homework and have a look. If you're not an international level athlete, and if this is a development camp, and I believe it includes young athletes, you might not yet be an international level athlete. You might be a national level athlete. And in that case, you submit your TUE application to your national anti-doping organisation. So I know that's confusing, but the best thing to do is, if you need to take some medication, is assume that you need a TUE. You can ask the IPC or your NADO, and they will tell you whether you need to apply or not. And the reason that it's important is if you take the medication and you don't have a TUE, even if you're taking the medication for a really genuine health concern, if you test positive and you don't have a TUE, that's an anti-doping rule violation. So there's one exception to everything I've just said, and that is, of course, a medical emergency. Your health's really important. So if you need medical treatment in an emergency situation, just forget about everything and take the medication. And then you can take care of the TUE later on. So I mentioned an important change to the 2022 prohibited list, and to be honest, I'm a little bit nervous about Lillehammer because it's the first big event after the 1st of January, and after this webinar, I don't want anybody to be caught out by this change. So the most significant change relates to injected glucocorticoids. Now, this is a treatment that's very common if you've got a soft tissue muscle or a joint injury in sport, so they're done all the time. But from the 1st of January 2022, all injected glucocorticoids are banned during competition. So this change doesn't mean you can't use glucocorticoids to treat sports injuries. It just means you need to be very mindful about when you use it and whether you need a TUE. So from the 1st of January, if you need an injection to treat an injury during a competition, you need to get a TUE first. If you need an injection out of competition and you've got no plans to compete in the immediate future, you can have the injection without a TUE. So the danger is if you get an injection close to a competition, if there's any chance that that substance will still be in your system when you're competing, you should apply for a TUE. So this is where the washout period is important. So the washout period is how long it takes for a substance to wash out or be eliminated from your body. And it varies. You know, little people take longer, big people, maybe it flushes out quicker. So if you are competing in Lillehammer, please be really careful. I don't want anybody to get caught out. I'll be very upset. Okay, the other big risk of accidental doping are supplements. In fact, these are probably the biggest risk. Supplements are very different to medications. Their manufacturer is not regulated, so you can't necessarily trust the list of ingredients on the label. Many athletes return positive tests, not because they're doping, but because they used a supplement without realizing it contained a banned substance. And that could be because they were careless, or it could be because the supplement was contaminated. No matter what it says on the label, no matter what the salesperson says to you, no matter what your mates say to you about it, taking supplements is always going to involve a level of risk. For example, the label on the supplement could be missing some ingredients by accident or on purpose by the person who made it, or the supplement could have become contaminated with a banned substance during the manufacturing process. Unless you have the supplement tested, you can't really be sure what's in it. So we know that athletes want to take supplements, and some athletes do genuinely need to take supplements. So I'm not going to tell you don't take supplements because I know that's not going to work. But I'm going to give you some advice to help you minimize the risk, and then it's your decision if you want to take the risk or not. So first up, have a look at your diet. Do you really need the supplement, or can you make improvements to your diet to give you the same benefit? Second one is, does the supplement actually do what it claims? So get some professional advice. Talk to a doctor or a nutritionist and ask whether the supplement actually works or not. The supplement makers make a lot of money by selling supplements that don't do anything really. And please don't ask the person selling it to you. They want to make a sale. Some types of supplements are riskier than others based on what they do or what they claim to do. So, for example, if you're just taking a simple vitamin C, that's very low risk, very unlikely to be a problem. Whereas if you're taking a pre-workout, that's very high risk. Never, ever take a pre-workout before competition, because most pre-workouts, maybe not most, but a lot, I would say most, are probably contaminated with a stimulant. And also look at who makes it. Is it a reputable brand? If you're buying something cheaper and less well known on the internet, it's a high risk. Probably someone's making it in a bath in their garage or something. So, you know, just be really careful. Batch testing simply means that a batch number of supplements has been tested for banned substances. And this probably provides the best assurance that the supplement's okay to take. But it's expensive, and most athletes don't have access to it and can't afford to do it themselves. So at a minimum, what you can do also is do some basic research on the internet. So, for example, you can search the product and brand using keywords like anti-doping and banned substances. And I've got an example on the next slide. So this is an internet search on a supplement. It's a supplement that I know caused a positive test for an athlete back in New Zealand. And you can see in the red circle here, I've just entered the name of the supplement, and then I've put banned substance, or you could put anti-doping in there or something. And if there's been a positive test related to the supplement, it will probably show up in this type of search, especially if it was a high-profile athlete who tested positive. So this is your second bit of homework to do after the webinar, is to have a look at what supplements you're taking and do a basic internet search and see if you can find anything out about them. Just because the internet doesn't say anything doesn't mean that it's safe, but it's a sort of a really easy check to do. And just remember the strict liability rule, where you're responsible for any substances found in your sample. So you really have to ask yourself, is it worth the risk? Okay, let's talk about the doping control process. So some of you listening may have been tested lots of times. Others may not have been tested at all. Maybe somebody listening is going to be tested for the first time at Lillehammer. I could talk to you for a couple of hours on the doping control process, but I'm just going to have to give you a real quick whistle-stop tour. So if you have been tested lots of times, you kind of know what to expect, and you'll also recognise if something's not quite right in the process. So, you know, just like anything, there are good testing organisations and bad testing organisations. If you've been tested for the first time, you're probably going to be quite nervous and a little bit unsure of how it works. So the doping control process starts when a doping control official notifies you that you've been selected for testing. So they might come to your house, they might come to your training venue, they might turn up at your training camp tomorrow, or they might approach you after you've competed. They'll have some ID, and they'll tell you your rights and responsibilities when they notify you, and you'll have to sign a form. So soon after you've notified, you must then report to the doping control station. This is where you provide the sample and get processed. There'll be other athletes waiting there. Only authorised people are allowed to enter the doping control station. When you're ready to provide your sample, a doping control official is going to go into the toilet with you and watch you while you provide your sample. And this is the bit where the new people might get a bit of stage fright. So the doping control official will ask you to roll your sleeves up to your elbows, lift your top up, drop your pants down to your knees, and they really are going to watch you. And there's been many a time when I've watched athletes as a doping control official myself, and they get stage fright. So you run the tap and you chat to try and get them to go and try and help them relax. And you can also think, what's worse, being watched or doing the watching? So it's not necessarily pleasant for either, but it's the rules. So once you've provided your sample, you should only you should touch your sample until you've sealed it securely in the bottles. Now, if you've got a disability that makes this difficult, your representative or someone else that you approve of can do this for you. Once your sample is sealed, the doping control officer will take you through the paperwork, and you need to pay attention to make sure that everything's correct. Then you sign it and you'll get a copy of the form. And then your sample is sent off to a WADA accredited laboratory for analysis, and that can take some time. And essentially with testing, no news is good news. So if you don't hear anything, that means it was negative. And if you get a phone call, well, that's not so good. So that was a really quick rundown of the doping control process. If you want to find out more, there's information on the IPC website. And I think on the Tokyo page of the IPC website, there is an animated video, which is quite fun to watch, which really summarises the process quite well. So I talked about rights and responsibilities when you get notified. So athletes have rights and responsibilities in testing. Testing doesn't always happen at a convenient time. And if you've just lost a competition, the last thing you feel like doing is doping control. But regardless of how happy or unhappy you might be with your performance, you are obliged to cooperate with doping control no matter when or where you're notified. The doping control staff should be understanding of your needs and accommodate them where they can. And in really rare circumstances, they will actually withdraw the test. But that would be very rare. So it's really useful to know yourself what your rights and responsibilities are. We really recommend that you take a representative with you if you're selected for testing. That can be your coach, manager, teammate, even a parent. It's especially important if you're a minor or if you're being tested in a foreign country. And the reason is you've just got someone else there witnessing and supporting you and witnessing what happened. If anything funny goes on, they're there to see you, and they're also there to support you. You can also have an interpreter if there's one available. You can ask questions at any time during the process if you're not sure about something or you just want to understand the process a little bit better. After you've been notified that you have been tested, you don't have to go to the doping control station straight away if you've got a good reason. So, for example, say you've got a medal ceremony, or you need to talk to the media, or you've got to want to do a warm down. You don't have to go to the doping control station straight away. And of course, for para athletes, and also if you're a minor, you're allowed to modify the sample collection process to accommodate your needs. And last but not least, if you do have any concerns about your test, say something. You have a right to make a comment on your doping control form if you're unhappy with parts or all of the process. Not everybody feels comfortable saying something during the test, so you can also tell your team manager or tell the NPC, but tell them as soon as possible after the test and put it in writing so it's been documented. Okay, you've also got some responsibilities. Once you're notified, you're responsible for staying within sight of the doping control officer at all times until you've provided your sample. You're obliged to cooperate with the doping control requirements, and that includes providing some valid, preferably photo identification, and reporting to the doping control station as soon as you can, unless you've got a valid reason to delay. An important point to note here for para athletes is if you need additional equipment to provide a sample, so if you need a catheter or some other device to provide a sample, it's your responsibility to provide that equipment. It's not the DCOs, it's not the NPCs, it's not the doctors, it's your responsibility. If you can't provide a sample because you don't have the equipment you need, you could face an anti-doping rule violation for failing to comply. Okay, so hopefully there are some coaches listening, because coaches have anti-doping responsibilities too. As the coach, you're in charge, so you determine what sort of behaviour is acceptable amongst your athletes, and you set the team culture. You're in a position of authority, and so you can do a lot to foster a positive attitude towards doping amongst your athletes. They're going to take their cues from watching how you behave. So I've already said that testing doesn't always happen at a convenient time. In fact, usually they turn up right in the middle of a training session that you're running, which can be very annoying, I know. Try not to get annoyed. Talk to the doping control officials about how the testing might be carried out with minimal disruption to your training session. And if the training session has to be interrupted, just remember how you approach it sets the example for the athletes. You can make it easy or you can make it hard. And just remember, testing doesn't happen every day. As a coach, you don't need to be an expert on anti-doping, but just as you take opportunities to learn and improve how you coach your sport, you should also take opportunities to increase your knowledge about anti-doping. So if you're listening to this webinar, that's a good start. Good on you. Okay, speaking up if you suspect doping, it's really hard to catch dopers. In an anti-doping organisation, you can have really strong suspicions that someone's doping, and you test them and you can't catch them. And then someone gives you a little bit of information, and that information is the last piece in the jigsaw puzzle that you can catch that athlete without a positive test. That's how intelligence works in doping, and everybody has a responsibility to speak up if they know of, observe, overhear, or have any reason to suspect that doping is occurring. So you can report your suspicions to your NPC, your National Federation or International Federation. That's the NPC or the IPC. You can report to WADA, or just tell someone in authority who you trust and let them take some action. Could be a coach, might even be your physiotherapist. But please tell someone, because like I said, often we have a lot of information and we're just looking for one last little bit to nail the case. So the IPC uses WADA's Speak Up program to capture anti-doping intelligence. So you can go onto the WADA website, and they've got a secure online platform where you can provide the information in total confidence. And you can do it anonymously if you want to. Okay, how are we going for time? We're doing good. Okay, so what happens if you break the rules? So if you break the rules, that means you've committed an anti-doping rule violation, and there are 11 anti-doping rule violations. So doping is usually associated with a positive test, because for many years that was really the only tool we had to detect doping. But anti-doping's got a lot more sophisticated over the last 20 years, and today there are many different ways of detecting doping, and that's reflected in these 11 different anti-doping rule violations. Many of these rule violations actually require intelligence and investigations to determine, as well as testing. And different sanctions apply to the different anti-doping rule violations. So the length of ban can vary from just getting a growling, a reprimand, right through to a lifetime ban. Depends on the circumstances and how serious it is. I can probably do a quick whip through of what all these are, but if you want to find out more, it's best that you probably have a look yourself on the website. I'll use my laser pointer actually. I've always wanted to use the laser pointer. See how that works. Okay, so these two here, presence and use, that's pretty much the positive test. So if you've got the presence of a substance in your sample, you've obviously used it. Use can also be detected, for example, through the athlete biological passport, where your biological data indicates that you're doping, but we can't get a positive test. So you can also get caught that way. Evasion is hiding from the DCO, refusing to be tested, running away. Whereabouts failures for those athletes who are in a testing pool. If they don't provide correct information or aren't there when we turn up to test them, and if they do that 3 times within 12 months, that's an anti-doping rule violation. Am I speaking too fast, Elka? Should I slow down a little bit? It's good. Okay, tampering is interfering or disrupting the doping control process. So, for example, if you try and bribe a doping control official or you try and falsify documents. Possession is an interesting one. So if you, and this is how we've caught some athletes in New Zealand, if you buy something on the internet that's banned and it comes into the country and customs intercepts it and tells us, you will be charged with an anti-doping rule violation for possession, even though you don't even have it, just because you've bought it. So that's an interesting one for you. These next two are probably the most serious. Trafficking, which is selling, transporting drugs and administering a banned substance to an athlete. Those are really serious. And the bans for those are a minimum 4 years, maximum life. Complicity is if you try and hide anti-doping violation or try and help someone else hide it. Prohibited association. So say, for example, your coach gets a ban for something to do with doping. You're not allowed to work with that coach in a sporting capacity while he's banned, he or she. If you do, that's an anti-doping rule violation because you've associated with someone who's banned. The last one, discourage or retaliate, that is the new one that has just come in this year. And that is basically if you do anything to discourage or retaliate against someone who's reported doping to the authorities, that's an anti-doping rule violation. So all of these ADRVs apply to athletes and to guides, and only 7 apply to athlete support personnel. And I'll leave you to work out which ones those are. So let's talk about consequences. What are the consequences if you choose to dope? Well, one of the key reasons that doping's banned is because, as well as cheating, using prohibited substances for sport reasons and not health reasons is actually harmful to your health. Now, if you're actually caught breaking the rules, whether you meant to or not, then the consequences go even further than that. So for starters, it is extremely stressful to face an accusation of an anti-doping rule violation, especially if you didn't intentionally dope. You'll have the feeling that your whole world is about to come crashing down. Your reputation will be damaged. No matter what you do for the rest of your life, every media story they write about you will remind people that you cheated in sport. And people don't really appreciate the difference between intentional and unintentional doping. They'll all just assume you're a cheat. And you'll all know of athletes that have done that in the past. And every time there's a story about them, they mention that they got caught doping. Higher profile athletes in particular who break the anti-doping rules, they can be front page news. They become even more famous in their country or worldwide for all the wrong reasons. Your family and friends will also be impacted. They're going to share your stress and embarrassment. There's also financial consequences. Lawyers are expensive, and you're also likely to use any sponsorship endorsements, any government money, or any other sport-related income you receive. And last but not least, you will be banned from participating in the sport that you love. So don't dope. So what if you do test positive? Hopefully this will never happen to anyone listening now. But what if you do? And what if you didn't even know, you're not intentionally doping? So it's very upsetting and overwhelming. Your NPC will be advised if you return a positive test, and then there is a whole process to follow that will determine whether you committed an ADRV or not, how serious it was, and then how long you'll be banned for. I'm not going to go into the details of that process now, and hopefully you'll never need to learn about it. But I guess from my experience, especially at IPC, the one thing I want to tell you is just don't bury your head in the sand and ignore it. Sometimes if we face tough things, we think if we ignore it, they might go away, but the positive test is not going to go away, and ignoring it could actually make it worse. And actually facing up to it, you might realize it's not as bad as you thought. Ask for support from someone you trust. Get some legal advice if you can. If you can't afford a lawyer, there are some lawyers that will provide you with free advice if you ask. But mainly just be proactive and be responsive to the tribunal hearing your case. So when I worked in anti-doping in New Zealand and we dealt with athletes who were caught, they're not bad people. They've just made a bad decision or they've been careless. So, you know, don't be afraid to just face up to it and deal with the IPC if that's who you've been tested by. Okay, we're nearly at the end. One last slide. Where can you find out more information? Because I'm sure a lot of what I've just told you has gone in one ear and maybe straight out the other, because it's a lot of information. Hopefully you remember the key points. Go to a doctor. Remember to check about the banned substances. But if you do want to find out more, national anti-doping organisations, they are completely focused on anti-doping. So they have a really good source of knowledge and expertise, and they're very likely to have a range of education resources and courses where you can learn more. They'll be in your own language and they'll be set in your own cultural context. International federations, by contrast, they've got to run the sport as well as do anti-doping. Anti-doping is only a little bit of what they do. So that's why the national anti-doping organisations are a better first stop. The National Paralympic Committee has responsibility to support you in understanding your anti-doping obligations, so you can talk to them too. We've got all the key anti-doping information on our website, and you can email us if you've got any questions. If you want or need to do your own learning, the World Anti-Doping Agency has this very cool e-learning platform which has a wide range of courses for athletes, coaches, medical personnel. They're in different languages and you can access them for free and in your own time. They've also, if you live in a place that has not very good internet connection, Adele has a mobile app, so you can pick a course that you like, you can download it to your phone, take it home and do it later. And now I've got a special treat, especially for the people who are going to Beijing. We've got a special course, especially on Adele, for the 2022 Paralympic Games. So if you are heading to Beijing next year, we only launched this a week ago, or maybe just over a week ago. It's got all the key dates of the games and specific information about TUEs and other information that basically reinforces what I've told you in this webinar. You can find this course on the Adele page, or there's a link to it from our anti-doping page on the main IPC website. So I think that's a wrap from me. The next is for you. Questions. Have we got loads of questions, Elka?
Thousands. No, amazing. Great. Well, that was very insightful.
No questions.
And I think very, very, very important, actually. So,
oh, I've just
got
got
are there any
in my
questions?
No questions.
Please, raise your hand if you have any, or type them in the chat. Both. I hope the chat works, so we can get them there.
If you don't want to ask now, you can always flick your question to Elka later and she'll send it to me and I'll sneak the answer back to her.
Yep, I'm happy to forward any questions if there are later on. But no, amazing. I think two very important topics today that we had on the session with classification and anti-doping. And yeah, thanks Dia and Jude for very
No questions. Oh, I'm really disappointed. Can I just ask people who are listening, Elko, I assume you're going to get some feedback. We'd really like some feedback on the webinars. Like, did you find it relevant? Was it useful? Anything that you want to know more about and things like that? We'd really appreciate it. So please do send us some feedback afterwards. And have a great camp and good luck getting to Beijing.
Don't turn off, Jules. There's a question coming in.
Oh, a question.
In the chat.
Hey.
So I'm going to read it out. In general, have you found that awareness about doping has increased among athletes, or are there so many substances now it is even more confusing?
Okay, so I was an athlete 20 years ago, even 30 years ago, and I remember when I first started, I knew nothing. And the first time I got tested, I was so naive, and I thought that as long as I declared my Sudafed on the doping control form, I would be okay. So thank God I never got tested after taking Sudafed. So from when I was an athlete, absolutely, there's so much more information out there and people are so much more aware. But at the same time, it's actually, I don't envy athletes these days. You have to be so careful what you put in your mouth, and there's so much more testing now. So yes, definitely there's an awareness, but it's also a lot harder. And I don't blame athletes who become paranoid. If you keep it really simple, it's easy. But if you take a lot of supplements, for example, and a lot of medication, it's really tough to be an athlete these days in anti-doping. So yes, awareness has increased, but there's so much more to know.
A very good question, and of course, a lot of things. It was a good insight into the supplements you mentioned earlier that they just changed the name, but in fact, it's still prohibited. Okay, I think. Oh, there's a question from Jens. Please, Jens, come off mute.
Yeah, of course. I need to say something. First of all, really, really important topic. So thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask you a little about, we now had 1 or 2 seasons with COVID and not so many competitions and of course a lot of travel restrictions. How was your work going through this COVID? Were you able to test as much as earlier, or are you a little afraid for the season to come that some athletes have taken kind of advantage in this COVID situation?
So some athletes who took advantage of being locked down?
Yeah, when they know they're not tested and maybe take some shortcuts. I hope not.
Well, this is true. And if you look at the WADA statistics, you'll see that testing around the world was well below first stage at the pandemic. Certainly it's coming back up again now. But then, I'm in Germany and I'm sure that testing is hard with the limitations at the moment. So yes, testing was definitely affected for sure. But I think with those high-risk athletes, there's the athlete biological passport now as well. And so that kind of lasts a longer time. So, if someone's going to dope and their profile is suddenly going to change when we finally get around to testing them again, it might not be the positive test, but, we can still, even though we can't test them regularly, the athlete biological passport is a really good tool in that respect. I mean, have athletes used the opportunity to dope? I'm sure some have.
But hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. But yeah, it certainly has been a really interesting year trying to test in COVID.
Yeah, you're going like, and yeah, I can totally understand that this.
We test worldwide. So some countries we can test in, other countries no chance. No. So yeah, and that's hard too, because testing is generally uneven anyway. Some athletes in some countries get tested more than other athletes, and here because of COVID we weren't able to test some countries, but we could others. But that's just the way it is.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Amazing, very good question, Jens. I think with that note, maybe we are good to to close, I want to thank everybody who was part of the 3 days. And now with the final day, I think we are now ready for the season. And luckily we can travel a bit. So first event in Canmore, and then we go to Wakati Championships. So I hope to see all of you that are in the call today at some place around the world in the coming season. And yeah, final thank you to you, Dia and Jude, for joining today on this very important topics. And any questions that come afterwards, I'm happy to forward to both of them. So please feel free to email to nordicskiing@webparsnosports, or if you have my personal email address, feel free to email me directly. Very good. Thank you, everybody. Have a good luck for the season and hope to see you around.
Thank you. Bye.
See you.